But because they're both such staunch believers, it's like, is Sergeant Howie that different from the locals? Like, he thinks he's so different, but is he really? And so just the constant disorientation of it all to then climaxing in this final 30 minutes or so just was so effective. Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I am talking about The Wicker Man. So this won a book versus movie poll, so thank you to everybody who voted. And I really appreciate people who interact with my channel, whether it's voting in the polls, liking videos, commenting videos, and obviously, I enjoy getting to know my audience, but of course, selfishly, it also helps boost my channel when people interact with it more, you know? But yeah, I like getting my audience involved in the book versus movie videos I do, so once again, thank you to everybody who voted in that poll. And so yeah, for The Wicker Man, we have the 1973 movie directed by Robin Hardy, and that is loosely based on the book Ritual by David Pinner, which was released in 1967. And then, of course, we have the 2006 Wicker Man remake directed by Neil LaBute. And then I also watched Midsommar by Ari Aster, released in 2019 for the first time because it relates to the topic of the Wicker Man. And so at the end, I will also share my thoughts on Midsommar. And because I have very different thoughts on all four of these, like there's different things to talk about as far as each is concerned. So this will be a longer video. And as always, it is broken up into the timestamps so you can hop around as you see fit. Of course, I would love for you to watch it all the way through, but I will leave it up to you to decide. And I'm actually going to do things differently today, and I'm going to start with the section where I say which one wins, and also in this section I will give my spoiler-free thoughts on all three of them, and then from there I will get into the details. So between the three of these, I would say the 70s movie wins. I really enjoyed this one. It's pretty short, and I almost wish it was longer, and yet it's such a tight script, and it's funny and weird while also being a little disturbing, and it also has great music. So I would recommend it. The 2006 movie I would also recommend. Yes, it's funny and dumb at times, and this one is short too, and yet there were so many scenes I felt could have been deleted. You know, the 70s movie, I almost wish it was longer, whereas this one, it could have been even shorter, to be honest. And the director is trying to do a lot of different things with this script, and it often isn't executed the best. However, I still like what he's trying to do, and it is very entertaining. And then the book I would almost recommend simply because it is such a bizarre experience. And so I wouldn't recommend it earnestly, like, wow, this is a good book, you should read it. But rather, I want to recommend it just so people can experience what this book is like. The writing is so odd and it can be so distracting, and the plot is kind of convoluted. And it took me a while to even figure out the plot, but I finished it 5 to 7 days ago now, and so I've had enough time to think about it, and so now I think I do know what happened. But initially, after I finished it, I was just so confused. But yeah, it's kind of an insane ride to read this book, and it's just, again, the way it's written is so weird. So I would recommend this to people just so they can experience how bizarre this book was. By the way, it seems like this book isn't a popular one, and many people don't even know The Wicker Man is loosely based on this book. And so if anyone watching has read it, I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to hear what you make of the plot and what you think as far as what I had to say about it. And so yeah, I would love for people to share their thoughts on this book. And I am now going to get into the details of the plot. So we will have spoilers for all of these going forward. And I am going to begin first with the book. So Inspector David Hanlon of Scotland Yard goes to a small village in Cornwall because he sees in the newspaper that a young girl has died, and he thinks she was killed in a ritualistic murder. And he is obsessed due to his past. He is obsessed with these kind of killings. And so he seeks them out to investigate them because a number of years ago, I don't know if we're ever told how long ago, but he was very close to a young girl, and we're told it's the closest he ever got to having a daughter. And she was killed in a way that he thinks was ritualistic. And so now he tracks these down as a way to put his mind at rest about this young girl whose killer he never found. But the town itself is skeptical as to how this young girl died, and they think that something suspicious happened, especially her mother, who we learn is the local witch. Yet when Hanlon shows up, they all change their story, and now they're adamant that it was an accident. And yeah, they're just all very evasive and never give Hanlon clear answers to his questions, and they all act very strange, including the children. However, eventually, so the young girl who died, there was another girl present, and she tells them it was an accident and the girl just fell from a tree, but they don't believe her. Eventually, they put her under hypnosis, and that's when she says, like, the girl truly did just fall from a tree. It was only an accident. And so at this point, the locals are like, okay, it was an accident. We accept that. However, Hanlon never lets it go, and he keeps thinking that it was murder. And then while he is there, a young boy dies in a way that could only be murder. And so with this one, like, there is no question about it being an accident. And so Hanlon is now just even more fired up than ever. And then that night at midnight, it will be Midsommar, and so he is invited to join some of the locals on the beach to celebrate, and he is planning to call them out on the murder of this boy at this event. However, once he shows up, like, there's these two men, one of whom is named Creedy, he's not the local leader, but he is a prominent figure in the town. And he and this guy who lives with him, who's like his servant of sorts, they're dressed as women, and Creedy, like, almost puts Hanlon in a trance, and he can read Hanlon's mind, and he's telling Hanlon of Hanlon's own past. And also, like, they're making gay remarks to Hanlon, sort of. And so Hanlon is just in a weird place during this event, and he forgets what he wanted to talk to the locals about. And he's also distracted by seeing what they're doing. However, at some point, he kind of breaks out of it, and he does confront them about the murder of this boy. But yeah, this whole night is just kind of a chaotic mess. And also the locals, their Midsommar ritual consists of them killing a horse in a really upsetting way as like a sacrifice. And then from there, it basically just turns into an orgy, and they're also all dressed up as animals. And one of the main characters, she is dressed up in bear skins, which is why I got that bear hat. I'll put it on at some point, but I feel like it'll be distracting if I'm wearing it during the video. But yeah, I actually bought that before I watched the 2006 Wicker Man, but obviously in that movie, Nicolas Cage dresses up as a bear, so it was very fitting. I also bought that before watching Midsommar, which, I mean, I'm going to share my thoughts on it, but that's a movie I almost just wish I could forget about. I almost wish I never watched it, but anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So the next morning after this whole event, Scotland Yard arrives in town because Hanlon had called them the previous day. And so while these other cops are like kind of talking to the locals, Hanlon, he thinks he knows who the killer is because there's this gypsy guy who lives in the woods named Jippo. And so Hanlon goes to see him, and he has a confrontation with Jippo, just the two of them. And Jippo does shoot Hanlon with an arrow in the shoulder, but Hanlon gets away. And then later he goes into the woods with these other cops, and they find Jippo's body pinned to a tree with an arrow, and he is dead, obviously. And Hanlon thinks that the two children's murders were done for the Midsommar ritual, but he thinks Jippo was murdered because he knew too much, because Jippo says he saw who killed Billy. And from here, he then goes to the big house owned by Creedy, who is like the weird guy who's kind of psychic and into weird things. And there are a group of people in his home, including Anna. And Anna is the sister of the girl who died at the beginning. And she is just this sex-obsessed young woman who has been wanting to get with Hanlon from the start. And she was part of the previous night's events. And her mother, again, is like the local pagan witch, basically. And so Anna just seems closely tied to everything because she is also someone the kids look up to and hang out with since she's, somewhere in her late teens, early 20s. But so Hanlon comes to the conclusion that she is the killer. And so he takes her away from this group, and they're on the beach when she's been wanting to get with him this whole time. And so she kisses him. And while they are kissing, his glasses are removed. And I haven't mentioned his glasses, but he wears sunglasses constantly. The only time he doesn't need them is when it's just the moonlight, because he has these weird purple or like magenta pupils. And so he is very sensitive to the sun. And when he doesn't have his sunglasses on, in daylight, the sun like pierces his eyes with pain, and he will black out and not remember what he does. And he gets violent when he doesn't have his sunglasses on from this pain he feels. And so she takes his glasses off, and then they're kissing, and she's lying on top of him when he then kills her And then he puts his glasses back on, but again, he will black out when he gets these violent outbursts without his sunglasses. And so when he puts his glasses back on, he doesn't remember having killed her. And so he goes to the police and he's like, oh, Anna's lying on the beach, but she won't wake up. I kept calling to her and she wouldn't move. And so the cops go over there and they see that she's dead. And in the end, Hanlon has just totally lost it and has had an official mental breakdown. And yeah, this book was just written in such a weird way. And the things people say were just so odd, like Hanlon as well as the locals. Like their conversations, you're just like, what? Who talks like this? Like, what is, like, it just felt so weird. And I just felt disoriented almost the whole time. And it almost feels like a fever dream. And the plot was also kind of confusing. And we get these details about Hanlon's past because he has this brother who would torture him. And so clearly that plays a part in the story we are reading about and the events we are reading about right now. And yet it all just comes across kind of vague. And I guess that's the point, since Hanlon gets more and more crazy as the story goes on. And his eyes were such a weird detail about his character. And he didn't have this problem when he was a kid, I don't think. And yet we never learn when the stuff with his eyes took place. Like, was it a thing when he was a kid? Also, was his brother even real? Like, part of me, I'll get into it later, but Hanlon kind of has like a double personality. So part of me is like, what if his brother wasn't even real? What if that was like another part of his personality? But then, I don't know, maybe that's pushing it. I think his brother probably was a real person. But yeah, his eyes were such a weird detail. And I don't recall ever hearing how or why this happened. We do hear he has scars on a variety of places on his body, presumably from his childhood with his brother. But yeah, and then Creedy seems to be telepathic and is telling Hanlon about his own past. And yet, was that legit? Like, is Creedy really telepathic? Or again, did Hanlon, Creedy is a real person, but did Hanlon latch onto him and make himself think that Creedy was talking to him in his head when really it was just Hanlon being crazy? Again, if you've read the book, I would love to hear your thoughts on all of this. But yeah, I just felt like I could never get my footing with this story. And again, that very may well have been the intention. So in some ways, the author succeeded in what he set out to do. And while I like weird books, I also like them to have something that I can get a grasp on. Whereas this one, like the story, felt as slippery as the locals who were never giving Hanlon straight answers, right? But I did like the dry humor in this book and some of the weird jokes that are made, and certain parts of the writing style actually reminded me of Hunter S. Thompson in some ways. But in general, the book just feels scatterbrained and comical and gross and nonsensical, and then the way it's written was also just so distracting. And I also saw someone on Reddit share quotes from this book in the thread Men Writing Women. And yes, there is some really weird writing in relation to the character of Anna. But to be fair, this whole book is just incredibly odd in its word choice and descriptions. But I did like how often nature was written about. The people themselves are referred to as animals right from the start, and then in the end they are, of course, literally dressed as animals. And the natural world is worshipped by the locals in a sense, like they have a reverence for it. However, they do kill a horse in the end, but then it's done as a sacrifice, kind of. But then, yeah, you have Hanlon, who is at odds with nature. But then also, there is a butterfly present when the girl at the start dies, and it flutters around before then being killed, and later someone jokes about that being Diane reincarnated, which kind of seems to then have been taken and used in the movie because that is what they believe in the 70s movie. But then to talk about David Hanlon a bit more and share what I think the whole plot, what I think is actually happening. So again, I think he has some kind of double personality going on because there are parts of himself that he tries to suppress. He has like what he calls this Puritan side of himself. And then he has this other side of himself that almost is not a sexual deviant. And yet the way he talks about himself, I'll share some quotes, it almost comes across that way. And so he can't find a balance between these two sides of himself. However, it has to come out in some way, right? And so I think when his glasses are removed, that's when this other side of him becomes violent and is able to get out. And then to share some quotes from the book about him, he was a failure in his job. Well, not quite. Some 5 years ago, when he wasn't so tired all the time, he discovered a couple of sex maniacs. The higher authorities were very pleased with his sexual coup, but because of his own sexual makeup, he'd known what he was looking for. He had milder obsessions himself. His upbringing had nothing to do with his little Oliver Cromwell complex. No, he'd gone out of his way to be moral in reaction to the immorality around him. It was a kind of experiment with himself. But now he had tied himself hands and groin. He wished he hadn't. Sometimes he felt sexual violence vibrate in his center, but he controlled it. Oh, it was so easy to find those little girl killers. So easy. He woke up, very frightened. As sleep left him, he grabbed at the tail end of his dream. He needed to examine it by sunlight. Slowly, putting his glasses on, he relived his dream. He was aware of a mind, or perhaps two minds, trying to control him. And this quote is what he's thinking about the townspeople. They'd achieved a strange harmony of sadism and laughter, lechery and beauty. He almost envied them. He'd never known anything like it. The nearest thing to it was the Tahitians who practiced voodoo and were also Catholics. In this village, in their own secret way, they had found balance. It disturbed him. They had shown him he was a failure. He had come to destroy them, and they were destroying him. And then we know that Jippo saw who killed Billy, because in Jippo's perspective, we hear that he saw who did it. So we know that's a fact, that he did witness the murder of Billy. And then when he confronts Hanlon, we read, "It wasn't me, Inspector. You know it wasn't me. You know who it was, but you can't prove it, can you? And you don't want to, do you? You're very dangerous, Inspector. You think." David noticed that Jippo's accent had gone. There was a vague Cornwall burr, but it was very subtle. "Who did it then, Jippo? Who?" "You'll never live to tell it. Only two people know, you and I. I saw Billy murdered. Not even the murderer knows as well as you and I. Yes, I'm glad you like my speech better this way. So do I. Both ways are natural to me. The other is handier. Well, this is the end of the line. For you. This will be the last murder. The murder of you." After which, Hanlon's glasses are removed, right? And also, Jippo had shot him with an arrow, but then I think Jippo is the one who pulls the arrow out. And so I think it's safe to assume that from here, Hanlon blacks out without his glasses on. He gets violent. He's the one that kills Jippo with the arrow. But then once he puts his glasses back on, he totally forgets about it. And then in the end, he is talking to one of the officers and he says, "All I know is she can't have murdered Billy or Jippo. No, the murderer murdered her. But how could he? I only left her a minute. You will destroy him, won't you? I'm sure he murdered the little girl next door to me. You see, I can't go on anymore." So he himself right here seems to be confessing to the murder of that girl he knew in his past, right? Because he's like, I know that whoever killed that boy also killed her. And we know that he killed that boy, and he killed Jippo, and he killed Anna, which therefore leads us to assume pretty obviously that he also killed this girl from his past. But yeah, he suppresses these memories and consciously does not want to acknowledge this about himself. And so, yeah, this book was just nothing what I expected, because the locals aren't even committing murder. They're not, they have some weird beliefs, of course, and they do kill that horse, but they themselves didn't lure him there to murder him, and they themselves aren't actually murdering people. So yeah, the book was very different from what I had expected. And to move on to the 1973 movie. So again, this is loosely based on the book. And so I'm first going to start out saying what's the same between the two before then getting into other details about the movie. So both have a cop. Here he is Sergeant Howie from the city going to a remote village to look into what happened to a young girl. So in the book, he was looking into a young girl who died, whereas in the movie, he was sent a letter saying that a young girl has been missing. And so he goes to the island to see what happened to her. And then both have locals who won't give him a straight answer, or when they do answer him, they lie or talk in crazy ways, basically. I would say, in the movie, they're pretty elusive with what they say, but in the book, it felt even more confusing the way the locals spoke. But we do get that in the movie too, where they either straight up lie or they're just weird with their answers. And both also have a hot young woman. In the book, it was Anna. Here, her name is Willow. And she stays in the room next to where he sleeps while he is in town. And in both, they have a sexual experience through the wall, but he resists in both. Although in the movie, he straight up resists going over there. But in the book, he does eventually go into Anna's room. However, she has fallen asleep by the time he finally goes over there. And so nothing ends up happening between them. By the way, on IMDb, so much trivia was just about this dance scene with her. And yeah, it's a weird scene, and her dance is so odd. But yeah, so much of it was about the fact that she's naked, and it's just like, Like, it's a naked lady, okay? Like, move on. We don't need a billion pieces of trivia about this. And then in the movie, he also sees people openly having sex outside, which was like the book, although in the book this happened during the Midsommar ritual, whereas in the movie he sees it the first night he's there. And then also the first night he's there, he sees people watering graves, which initially seems weird until you realize that they plant trees on top of the graves, so that's why they're watering them. But in the book, he sees a guy watering the cemetery, watering the graves, but then later he picks up the watering can and it has no bottom. So the guy was like watering them, but there was no water in it. So in the book, it was just like this bizarre scene that seemed to have no purpose, whereas in the movie, they kept it, but made a reason for it. And then we have the island's leader, Lord Summerisle, who in some ways is like the Creedy character in the book. And Lord Summerisle is also dressed as a woman during the ceremony in the end, kind of like how Creedy was. And by the way, he is played by the great Christopher Lee, who looked like he was having a blast while making this movie. By the way, in the book, Hammer Productions is mentioned, and Christopher Lee, of course, was in quite a few Hammer production movies. He played Dracula in a number of those, and so I thought that was a fun little correlation. But then in the movie, they don't have Christianity at all, and they just have these pagan, I don't know if it's ever called pagan, but they just have these pagan beliefs. Whereas in the book, they did have a Christian church and a priest, and they would go to church. However, like, no one really believed it, and it was just like obligatorily going through the motions just to keep up appearances. But most of the people cared more about their midsummer rituals and those type of things more so than their Christian church. And in the book, the main character, again, he has like these two sides to himself, but the main side, he will refer to his sensibilities as puritanical. But in the movie, they take this to a new level, and the cop is a devout Christian and is even a virgin still because he does not believe in sex before marriage. And this is important because we find out that they needed a virgin sacrifice. And so the fact that Willow tempts him through that wall, that seemed to be a crucial moment, right? Because like he had to be tested to make sure he would stay pure, kind of a thing. But it's funny to think that if he'd gone in there to have sex with her, he would have lived, I assume. And there's a scene where as he is seeing all of these weird things being done on the island, he talks to Lord Summerisle about it, talking about how strange their beliefs are. And he's like, where's the Christianity? And Lord Summerisle then summarizes Christianity in a way that is making the point that the ideas in Christianity are also pretty odd, if you really think about it. Like, every religion is weird. Some are just so normalized that we no longer see it as strange. And then, in the end, we find out that this whole thing was a trick. They lured him to the island because he had to come of his own free will, and they lured him there to use him as a sacrifice to appease their gods because they had a very bad crop the previous year. And the girl he thought was missing, they made it seem like they were going to use her for a sacrifice, and so they got him to try to save her, which then just leads him, they were just manipulating him, right, in order for him to truly be the sacrifice. And so he is placed inside this giant Wicker Man statue along with a lot of other animals, which is then set on fire. By the way, in the book, the events take place on Midsommar, but both movies have the ritual take place on May 1st. But as they chant their song while he is dying, he is singing his Christian songs and prayers. And so these two faiths, they may be at odds, and yet they each believe their respective religions so wholeheartedly. And it's almost like, who's to say which is the more normal of the two? Which I know that's a stretch considering the locals are committing murder, right? But just in terms of religion, people of faith believe their religion so firmly, and when you try to talk to them using logic, it literally doesn't matter because faith and religion is something deeper than logic. And I say that as someone where I do believe in God and I do believe in an afterlife. And I know maybe logically that might not make sense. And if someone tried to use logic to convince me there is no God, I kind of wouldn't care because I'm just like, whatever, you can believe that if you want. But the thought that this earth and our existence is here for no reason, and when we die, we're just gone forever, like there's no greater purpose to it, like that doesn't make sense to me. And so it makes more sense to believe that there's something greater going on. And yet at the same time, I realize that a lot of religions are kind of far-fetched and weird in their own ways. But yeah, here the locals and the cop believe there is a deeper meaning to their lives as well, and they are staunch believers. They just express it in different ways. But because they're both such staunch believers, it's like, is Sergeant Howie that different from the locals? Like, he thinks he's so different, but is he really? And at the start of the movie, we get those flashbacks that show Sergeant Howie participating in his own rituals, right? So I think that was obviously included to be a parallel to the locals. And this movie is a horror movie, like it's considered folk horror. And where the horror comes in is the fact that there are weird customs from the past that they embrace. Like, we see how they have reverted back to believing old wives' tales and the things people believed before Christianity came around, which, some of these countries, Christianity was forced upon the people and they were forced to reject their old ways. But yeah, these people have reverted back to these ideas and they believe so wholeheartedly that they are willing to commit murder. And so I guess that's in part where the disturbing element comes in, right? Because they think that what they're doing, they have a good reason for. And it's like, wow, like they're so demented and don't even realize it. But yeah, I just love the juxtaposition between Howie, who is super Christian, and the locals who are pagan. And that final scene is just fantastic when you have them joyously singing their song, and then you see him in terror singing his hymns inside the Wicker Man. And so yeah, it's just so interesting to think about that. And while in this story it is the pagan type people that are committing murder, there have been times in history when it was the Christians committing murder in the name of their religion. And of course, anyone committing murder in the name of Christ isn't a true Christian, because that goes against everything Jesus taught. But yeah, plenty of Christians have unfortunately used his name to condone their killings, just as the locals here are using religious conviction to condone their killings. And as the way Christians in the past forced their religion on people and got them to get rid of their folklore beliefs, that's what Howie is doing, right? As soon as he shows up on the island, even before he knows whether or not they're doing something wrong, he is forcing his beliefs on them. And this could be something else that was inspired from the book in part, because the fact that the book is about this wannabe Puritan who keeps talking about having an Oliver Cromwell complex. And, it's about a guy who is wanting to believe these pagan believers are committing murders when really he's the one doing it. So it also feeds into this theme of Christianity being violent and interfering with the lives of these people who are definitely weird, but they're not the ones committing the murder. And part of me, I didn't like the locals, and yet I didn't like Howie either. And so they almost, I lived in Berkeley, and so sometimes I just love the hippie vibe. And so just like the hippiness of them and how they're into nature and reincarnation, I was kind of into it to some extent. So again, not condoning what they do, but there was something about them that I was kind of into. And then some last few things I wanted to mention. So partway through this movie, there's a lot of music. And I was like, wow, this is borderline a musical. And I read in the trivia that the director, partway through filming, he was like, oh, by the way, we're turning this into a musical. And so that is kind of what he was going for. And I love folk music, so I have been listening to certain songs from this soundtrack repeatedly since watching this movie. And so yeah, I loved the musical aspect. The songs are weird, especially the one they sing about Willow in the bar because she's the bartender's daughter. And it's this raunchy song that she's super into. And so again, just showing how these locals don't have, the Puritan morals that Howie has. And then a part that I thought was funny is when he's looking at this log that shares people who have recently died, and two people, their names were Rachel and Benjamin. And he's like, oh, biblical names, because most of the locals have names like Willow and Rose and Rowan. And so he's like, wow, actual Bible names. And the lady who's in charge of the paperwork or whatever, she's like, yeah, well, they were really old. So showing how, in Howie's world, having these weird nature names is the old school way, whereas here, having Bible names is the old school way. Also, I love how at the beginning of the movie, we get that section where it's we would like to thank Lord Summerisle for complying and letting us film on his island and whatever. And thank you for the locals complying. And so it almost makes you think that wait, is this a real guy? Which obviously it isn't. But I wonder if it's a Fargo situation. Did people watch this and think that was for real and this was a real place? I'm not sure. But I thought that was a funny way to start the movie. But yeah, again, I really liked this movie a lot and I would definitely recommend it. And now to move on to the 2006 movie. So a lot of people say that this is one of those so bad it's good kind of movies, and that Nicolas Cage's acting is unintentionally funny. However, I myself think that Cage was aware that some of these moments are pretty over the top. You know, there is the infamous "not the bees" scene, which, by the way, I watched the theatrical cut. I had never seen this movie before. I watched the theatrical cut, and the "not the bees" scene doesn't exist. And so that actually is a deleted scene. And yet, sometimes when movies are played on cable, they will include deleted scenes. So some people think this is part of the movie, but really, this wasn't part of the theatrical cut. But yeah, that scene, for example, I feel like he knows how silly that is, right? Like, I'm a big fan of Nicolas Cage, and I think, yeah, he has a weird sense of humor, but he also is an incredible actor. And so yeah, I feel like he was intentionally playing this in like this silly, campy way, because if he wanted to try to more sincerely act in this moment, he could have, right? He has the acting chops for it. So I think he knew what he was doing. So yes, it's funny, but I don't think his acting is unintentionally funny. But again, I say that as a big fan of Nicolas Cage, so I'm sort of defending the fact that some people think he's a bad actor at times, because yeah, I think he's very intentional when he does things like this. And then I also did like that he does die in the end, as in the original film. I thought maybe like because his ex lures him here, I was like, oh, is she gonna have a change of heart at the last minute or something? But no, he does die. So I like that they stayed true to that. But again, it is weird because in the theatrical cut, they like bombard him, and then we see them walking to the Wicker Man, and then we hear the audio played over this scene where his legs are being broken, and he's talking to them saying like, oh, I don't believe your ways or whatever. Basically, again, the "not the bee" scene was cut from the theatrical version, and so before they put the bee thing on his head, they had broken his legs. And this was a scene that played out that you watched, but then I guess they wanted to secure a PG-13 rating, which is why they removed this scene. But then playing the audio over this moment later on was so weird. And then when he's revealed inside this thing they're carrying him in, he has all these bee stings, and you're just like, what just happened? You can tell something was cut. And so yeah, this was just a very odd editing choice, and I think it was a bad idea. But then also, I got so tired of the nightmare scenes, which often involved him thinking about the two who were killed at the start. But yeah, all of the dream sequences should have been cut, to be honest. And this movie didn't have the best pacing, but cutting those moments would have helped. Also, the pointless scene when he is trapped underwater, like, why was that even in there? And it felt like some of these moments, it felt like those were included because this is supposed to be a horror movie, but it's not very scary. So they're like, what if we add some like weird nightmare scenes and that'll add to it? But yeah, it just felt pointless. Like, get rid of all of those. But also, what was even the point of the opening scene with the two in the car being hit? Like, I have no idea what purpose that even served. I guess it just shows how like mentally fragile he is. And it also gives the audience, like, we see how he has time off because of this experience. And so that is why he has the time to go trampsing around the Pacific Northwest. So I guess that's why it was included. But yeah, let me know your thoughts on what the point of that opening scene even was. But here in this movie, he is not a virgin sacrifice. Rather, his ex, Willow, is a member of this group. So she had left the commune years prior, and she had been in a relationship with him. However, she abruptly ends it and leaves him. And we find out that she intentionally left the commune in order to find a man, get pregnant, leave him, return home, have the child, and then should a time ever arise when they need a sacrifice, it has to be someone blood related for some reason. And so should the time ever arrive when they need a sacrifice, they can use these men that are the fathers to their children. But I saw a funny Letterboxd review that said, a film that argues that every time you have sex with a woman, it might be step one in an elaborate bee-inspired scheme to farm sacrificial objects as protection against possible crop failure. But yeah, the fact that we see in the end them doing this again, and they specifically seek out guys who are cops, which makes sense because the personality type to become a cop, it's someone who wants to be a hero and come in and save the day. And so when they inevitably write him a letter being like, help, my daughter's missing, that cop personality is going to be like, oh, I got to go in and save the day. Also, the 73 movie has a scene where the cop hears a classroom lesson and the teacher is like, what does the maypole symbolize? And they are told it represents the phallic symbol because fertility of the land and of the bodies is a big theme this time of year on their island. And in the new movie, instead, she asks them, what does man represent in his truest form? And the answer is phallic symbol, showing that the women only view men as a resource to make babies. And that is all. At least that's how I took this. But it made me think of how men in the normal world will dehumanize women to only be sex objects, right? So that's kind of what they're indoctrinating these young girls. That's how they're indoctrinating them to view men. By the way, the teacher here is played by Molly Parker, who I recently watched in the King adaptation of 1922, which is a video that I filmed for a Patreon. So for $2, you will be able to watch that video, which will be up on Patreon later this week. Also, I'm doing a book versus movie for Psycho on Patreon as well. That will be up the end of October. So yeah, check out my Patreon if you want to get bonus book versus movie videos. And there are a lot of changes in this new movie from the 73 movie. By the way, the new movie is clearly just a remake. Like, they didn't take anything from the book. And so this isn't like a new adaptation. This is just a remake. But one of the interesting spins they put on the story is that the island is a matriarchy. And I think this works well because in the original film, the more the locals resist the cop, the more he wants to find answers. Although, to be fair, he does try to leave at one point. However, they have broken his plane, so he is trapped. But here in the new movie, I think this works even better because it's like the cop thrives on resistance, because the more the locals, who are all women, try to stop him, the more he wants to just force his way in. And considering this movie is making a commentary on the gender roles, as I will get into, this detail from the original I think is even more significant. And there are some men here who help with the labor as well as, the breeding, quote unquote. But the women hold all of the more important roles. And I love the scene where Edward, that is the name of the main character, he is talking to the leader, Sister Summerisle, and he accuses them of not liking men. And she is like, what? We love our men. They play such an important role, especially when it comes to breeding. And as soon as I heard this line, I was reminded of like these male-run churches who, if you accuse them of sexism, they're like, what? We love our women. And yet it's like, if you respect and love your women so much, why are they not given equal opportunities? But then I did want to mention that I read a review who basically made the assumption that this movie is sexist and that the director is sexist. And based on other movies he's made, a lot of people do come to this conclusion. However, I didn't think that. And if anything, he makes movies about toxic masculinity. So that's what he's really focusing on. And he has a movie that I have not seen, but it stars Aaron Eckhart. And again, it's about toxic masculinity and these guys who are mistreating women. And so here, I think Nicolas Cage represents that toxic masculinity. And I know that if you are making a movie about misogyny, as this director has done more than once, yet choosing to tell it from the perspective of the men and what they are feeling, that can almost feel problematic in its own way, because it's like, it's about the way these women are mistreated, and yet you're not even focusing on the women. It's from the man's perspective, so that has its own weird things going on. But at least he's trying to tell a story about sexism, despite how flawed his attempt is. And yeah, considering we literally see Cage punching women, it's not really surprising that people watch this and assume the director must hate women based on its face value. But yeah, I think if anything, he writes characters who hate women, but he himself isn't trying to tell the story promoting misogyny. But this all kind of leads me into something that I didn't realize until I read a Letterboxd review that talked about how the director is a former member of the Mormon Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so in this review, they mentioned different similarities between that church and this movie, showing how intentional much of the plot is in relation to the director's experience as being a former member. I did read that he converted when he was an adult, and then he's not a member anymore. So it seems like maybe it was a relatively short time in his life, but he did go to their college, so he was still immersed in the culture, right? But yeah, this just kind of goes to show that the movie, while being filmed as a dark comedy, also has more symbolism going on than the average person who isn't familiar with this religion might realize. And so I did want to share some of these parallels. So first of all, bees and beehives are a key symbol to the church, just as they are for these women. And Edward, we learn, is allergic to bee stings, which It's interesting because not only does he dislike bees, and he kills one soon after he arrives, which upsets the bartender lady, but not only does he dislike them, he's allergic to them. So considering bees are very closely tied to this church that the director is commenting on, he also wrote the script, by the way. And so the fact that the main character, who is the personification of toxic masculinity, sorry to be using that term so much, and then he's allergic to this, I don't know if you would call it a sacred thing for these women, but kind of. So the fact that he's allergic to this seems very significant. I still don't know yet what I think it's signifying, but it seems like there's some sort of point to be made here. By the way, since I'm talking about the 2006 Wicker Man and Nicolas Cage does dress in his bear costume, I guess now is a good time to put this on. Another parallel is that you hear in the movie that these women originally settled on the East Coast, but they were persecuted, so they made their way westward and they've landed in the Pacific Northwest. Whereas the early pioneers of the Mormon Church, they were based in the East and slowly inched their way west for the same reasons, because they were persecuted. And they settled in Utah. And Utah, the state flag has a beehive on it. So that tells you how important of a symbol this is. And in the end, we see Willow with another woman going out into the normal world to snag a man who could potentially be used for future rituals, which is kind of similar to how the LDS Mormon Church will send out missionaries who are in a pair and they'll go out and try to recruit people. But in the end, one of these women, so it's the one who tried to stop Nicolas Cage from putting on the bear costume, but I think it's safe to say, like, she expressed the desire to leave this commune early on. And so I think when she's attacking him in this moment, she's not doing it to hurt him, like she's doing it to help him, right? Because she knows what's going to happen. So I think her attacking him was actually her trying to help him. But of course he misinterprets this and like knocks her out. But we see her in the end, she is one of the two who are out in the real world. And when she is alone with a guy who is played by James Franco, she asks him to take her home with him so that she can escape. And so this is interesting too, because even though in her community she is the preferred gender, ultimately she still hates it and she wants out, and she is haunted by the sounds of Edward as he was in the Wicker Man being burned. And so this is interesting too, because I've said this about patriarchal structures where patriarchy hurts men as well as women. And so therefore a matriarchy also hurts women as well as men. You know, my dream is to live in a world where everybody is equal. All genders, all people are viewed equally. They all have equal opportunities. That's my dream. But will that ever happen? I don't know. And obviously, you know, the Mormon Church is run primarily by men. Women have leadership roles, but they're not like the significant ones. But to be fair, like neither does the Catholic Church, right? I talk about that in Conclave. And so sexism is a very universal thing that can't be blamed on one specific group or another, because it exists literally everywhere, pretty much. And so this specific church certainly isn't unique in that respect. By the way, I don't want my comment section to turn into like people hating on the church. I do want to be respectful. If people want to share their comments on this down below, just don't be hateful about it. And so, yeah, even though certain things the director is doing, I can admire. I like his commentary on sexism, I don't think is executed the best. And same with his parallels to this church that he has experience with, I also don't think is the best. And yet I can appreciate what he was trying to do. But I think maybe the script was kind of a bit too jumbled and maybe he was trying to do too many things. But this is still a movie I liked, and I certainly wouldn't give it 1 star, right? Which is a very common rating on Letterboxd that I saw. Like, it's a decent movie and it's very entertaining. And again, I think it's more intentional than people give it credit for. So I would still recommend it. But now that my Wicker Man coverage is done, I now want to move on to sharing my thoughts on Midsommar. So yeah, I watched the 2 Wicker Man movies the same day, and then the next day I watched Midsommar. So it was an interesting 48 hours. And this movie, again, it's one that I like. It's amazing. On one hand, it's amazing. And yet on the other hand, I regret ever watching it, to be honest, because certain things I have not been able to get out of my head. But this is almost like the newer Wicker Man, where it is a member of this commune who lures people to come join him so that they can be used in a sacrifice. However, here they need 9 people total. And so some of the people they use are the outsiders they bring in, but then also some of them are volunteers from the community who choose to be sacrificed. And the main guy who brings the Americans here, he tells us early on that his parents died when he was a child and that they died in a fire. And considering the sacrificial place is set on fire, we can assume that this is how his parents died. And then, there's 2 living members of the group who offer themselves. And before the place is set on fire, they're given something to eat, and they're like, so that you won't feel fear, so that you won't feel pain. And so they take this thinking that it'll protect them from this. However, once it's on fire, we hear them yelling and screaming, showing that they do feel fear and they do feel pain, which kind of shows that this whole religion maybe is a bit bogus because what they just took didn't even work. And so maybe they're realizing that they're dying for nothing in this final moment of their lives. But also the people outside, don't they hear the screaming? And that's why they themselves are screaming. So doesn't that kind of tell them that these people are in pain inside? I almost don't want to focus too much on that final moment because just that's one of the things that I don't even want to think about it. But I will talk about Danny, of course. But first, I want to talk about Christian. So first of all, his name, Christian. So instead of having an actual Christian sacrifice, it's a guy whose name is Christian. And in fact, all of the men had biblical names, all of the men who were brought in from the outside. But yeah, what Christian goes through obviously is traumatizing, to say the least. And he kind of sucked, right? Especially when he tells the other guy that he's going to do his thesis on this event, and he's so rude about it. And then later on, when their special book is taken, he throws this guy under the bus, basically being like, oh, I have no part of that. I don't want to associate with him, blah, blah, blah. He has no loyalty. But we see that Christian, he's a people pleaser, right? And as someone who is a recovering people pleaser of sorts, I could relate to him to some extent. In the beginning, he is being pulled between Danny and his friends, and he's trying to please both of them, but they have different wants. And so he's in this weird place, and the way he will just spur information on people, right? And the way he'll withhold information and the way he'll lie, they've been planning on going to Sweden for 6 months. And yet when it comes up, when Danny finally hears about it, he's like, oh yeah, maybe. I don't know. I might not go. We'll see. And it's you've been talking about this for 6 months. Clearly you're lying about this. And then in the last minute when he tells them oh, by the way, I told Danny she could come, but she probably won't, when of course she does. But once in the commune, he is using his people-pleasing instincts on the cult now instead, because you can't be a people pleaser to everyone. And so you kind of almost unconsciously pick who is top of the tier, and then whoever's top of the tier are the ones you strive to please. And so he had previously been torn between Danny and his friends, but then once in the commune, he pretty quickly is doing and saying things to please them and no longer cares about his own friends. But it's interesting because while he is trying to be allies with the members, Danny, who actually cares about her friends and isn't concerned with, getting chummy with the locals, she is the one who ends up being embraced, though, despite Christian's attempts to please them, quote unquote. And then, of course, the scene with Christian was so uncomfortable and disturbing, and it's a rape scene, right? And in the end, he runs out naked, but originally in the script, he was supposed to have a robe on. However, the actor suggested that he be naked because in movies where the woman is the victim, she will be shown naked, and it's a sign of her vulnerability, right? And so he felt that he should be undressed to show his vulnerable state in this moment. And I think that was a good call. And he and the others are constantly on drugs or being given these alcoholic liquids that they don't know what's in it. And so just the constant disorientation of it all to then climaxing in this final 30 minutes or so just was so effective. And also, he does drink the weird hallucinogen right before this ceremony. You could say oh, he's choosing to drug himself. He's choosing to go through with this. But not really. He's literally trapped. He's been realizing how weird this whole thing is, right? So I think he feels he has no choice, and he's this is gonna happen anyway. And so maybe he resists at first, but then he drinks it because maybe he's hoping that it'll help him be able to process it better or something. But ultimately, yeah, he's trapped. He chooses to go through the motions, but he really didn't have a choice at the end of the day. And yeah, the discomfort he feels in the final 30 minutes or so is just, you feel it I felt it so deeply and it was so uncomfortable. And yeah, the Pele, the guy who brought them there, like, wow, he sucked. In the Wicker Man, there's part of me that I'm like, oh, the locals, they're bad people. And yet I didn't hate them maybe as much as I should have. Whereas the people here, like, wow, these people suck. I hated them so much. They were terrible, especially the two who brought outsiders in. But Danny, of course, is the one who feels the discomfort and anxiety through most of the movie, and it isn't until the last 30 minutes that it then kind of transfers to Christian. Well, transfer isn't the right word, because she is under duress as well, up until like the final moment. But I get that this community makes her feel held, and she feels she belongs. But screw these people. Like, they are terrible. Like, yeah, she and Christian had a messed up relationship, but the cult uses that to sour her towards him all the more, just as a way to manipulate her, not because they care about her, but because they want to use her. And Florence Pugh said that after filming this movie, she felt guilty for abandoning the character of Danny, and she was worried about her. And she said something about how, like, she felt like Danny wasn't someone who could fend for herself. And so she felt guilty leaving this person behind. And that just tells you right there, right? Like, not only is Danny still not doing well, if anything, she is doing worse than ever before because she is in this horrible community now. And yeah, her life in the real world was pretty bad, but these people might communally feel her pain and they empathize with her, but again, they're just preying on her, and they chose her to be the special one because Pele and the others saw how vulnerable and alone and in need she was. Because cults don't recruit people who are confident and doing well. They recruit those who are desperate for one reason or another. And so they pretend to have empathy for you when really they're just manipulating you. And that's what they are doing to Danny. So she might be smiling in the end, but she is not doing well. And this is not a good situation she is in. And then I wanted to note that Pele says that in this community, they view their life as the cycle of the seasons. And so life starts out, spring, summer, fall, winter. And with Danny, the movie starts out in winter. And so we could see that as being the death of her old life. And when she arrives in Sweden, it's spring because in the movie, they are celebrating Midsommar. And so when she first arrives, it's still technically spring, which again is the start of her new life. She even has a birthday when she arrives. And then by the time the movie ends, it is midsummer, which means they are in summertime now. So she is in this next stage of her life. And so, yeah, I thought that was some cool symbolism of sorts as to her new rebirth in this community. But yeah, this movie is disturbing on so many levels, and it's one of the darkest movies I have seen, despite being so visually vibrant and colorful. And so the heaviness of it and the darkness, the depressingness of it is in part what makes me wish I never watched it. But more than anything, it's the visuals near the end, which have kept me up at night because I don't even want to think about it. But anyway, so this movie, on one hand, it's not a perfect movie. There are a couple maybe quibbles I have, but for the most part, I do think it's fantastic. And yet I would be hesitant to recommend it because of how disturbed I was watching it. But yeah, anyway, that's my thoughts on Midsommar. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Yeah, thank you for watching this video about Ritual, Wicker Man, Midsommar. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, especially those who watched this all the way through. I always really appreciate that. And yeah, I will see you next time. Bye.